The Australian Financial Review.
Today, China announced its first population decline in 6 decades.
Beijing's National Bureau of Statistics said the population decreased by 850,000 people to 1.4 billion.
In January, China revealed its population has started to shrink. The drop in 2022, while not a complete surprise, was 7 years earlier than expected. India's population, meanwhile, is still growing, and it's poised to overtake China as the world's most populous country as early as this month. It's a milestone that will have major economic and social consequences. Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, the Australian Financial Review Southeast Asia correspondent, Emma Connors, on how this historic shift will change the balance of power and what it means for the global economy and Australia's trade with the region. It's Thursday, April 6. Thanks for joining us from Singapore, Emma. It's great to have you on The Fin.
Cheers, Lisa. It's really nice to be here, speaking to you all in Sydney.
So by mid-year, perhaps as early as this month, the United Nations Population Division is expected to announce a change in the population rankings. India is going to overtake China. You're just back from a trip to India. Tell us what's happening.
Yeah, well, it's all happening in India, that's for sure. So what's going to happen this year is India will pull ahead of China in terms of population.
India is home to 1.4 billion people. This population is projected to soon become the world's largest.
India is estimated to have overtaken China as the world's most populous nation. That's 36% of the world's population.
Now, we don't know the exact day or the exact minute. Obviously, counting 1.41 billion people is an inexact science. Some think it may have already happened. But there was sort of quite a telling moment last year when China shrunk, and in India the number of births still far exceeded that of deaths. So we're really at a turning point here with these two great ancient nations swapping positions, passing the baton, if you will. Now, it's interesting if you look at it, what's happening globally. So there's been a lot of concerns over the decades about overpopulation, and now we're seeing the fertility rate overall is dropping down and population growth is slowing. The UN told us that it took 12 years to get from 7 to 8 billion, and we got there last November. But it's going to take 15 years, another 15 years until 2037 to get to 9 billion people. And the global population is expected to peak this century. So growth overall is slowing down. But in India, when you're there, you just get this sense of a really vibrant, moving nation that's advancing on all fronts. So we've got these two countries going in different directions. By 2050, China's population is going to be 8% smaller than it is now. And really, that shrinking is just going to pick up pace. Now, some say China's been the biggest country in the world since the fall of the Roman Empire, which happened, sometime around the 5th century. And certainly in the modern era, the United Nations has been keeping count since the 1950s, and China has been the biggest since then. So this is really quite momentous.
Emma, how did we get to this point? Let's start with China and its one-child policy. What impact did that have on its population?
Yeah, so China is an amazing story, and really it's a story that's changed quite rapidly. So in the 1960s, when I was born, you wouldn't have thought that China would be shrinking at this point. Back then, China was a baby machine. The average Chinese woman was giving birth to more than 7 babies. The fertility rate was 7.5. Now, that's really just astonishing. China's population grew by nearly 50% in 20 years, up to 1970. And in the beginning years, when the People's Republic of China was formed after that in 1949, the Communist Party actually banned contraception. It was so keen to grow the population. But then by 1970, there were big concerns about overpopulation, and the one-child policy began.
After careful study, the State Council deems it necessary to launch a crash program to control our population growth. For the next 30 years at least, all couples may only have one single child each.
And once again, you know, as someone who sort of grew up in the era, this policy was really a defining image of China for the West. You know, we heard these terrible tales about forced abortions and, you know, families who wanted a boy rather than a girl.
It is harsh, but is there an alternative?
So this is the policy that was in place since 1970. And Lisa, you could argue it worked too well. China's fertility rate fell off a cliff in the late 1970s, and it's been slowly declining ever since. By the 1990s, it was down to 1.5 births per woman, and it's now around 1.28, according to the World Bank. So that's way under the level at which you would replace the population. And as concerns mounted about China's ageing population, the Communist Party changed course, many think too late, and in 2015 changed the law to allow 2 children.
But it wasn't only China that introduced family planning policies. India, while it has a very different political system to China, also tried to get its population under control in the 70s. So what happened?
Well, a good point to start is probably to go back to the years immediately following the Second World War. In China, we had the triumph of communism with Mao's defeat of Chiang Kai-shek.
Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek relinquished his leadership after 22 years as China's dominant political figure. The way was left clear for communism to swallow up.
And in India, the British left very hurriedly.
With the fall of nationalist China, hope of saving Asia for democracy centered on the new state of India.
Of course, this is something India had longed for and fought for a century. But when it came, India was in a very tough place.
Time in which India, by surmounting her many problems, can achieve greatness as a modern nation and become Asia's new voice to the world.
So if you look at China and India in these years, you know, they're both starting anew. They both face immediate problems of great poverty and possible starvation. And they both take a centralised approach to trying to provide for its people. The key difference, of course, is that China's communist model meant all decisions were made by the party, whereas India prided itself as a democracy and indeed continues to pride itself on being the world's largest democracy. So when you've got an economy like that is centrally planned, the one thing you do have control over is the number of children you have. And especially for farming families, and most farms in India still to this day are very small, you know, you need as many kids as you can. So although the birth rate wasn't quite as high as China's, it certainly was more than women having more than 5 babies in the 1950s. And that stayed high for quite some time. And indeed, India stayed poor. So that population put incredible pressure on the country. At the same time, India faced huge challenges related to illiteracy and lack of access to, you know, really basic services like healthcare, education, sanitation.
5 mouths to feed, no rest at all. No wonder the poor mother is anemic and exhausted.
And they actually tried to introduce family planning in the late 1970s.
For her and for those who have more than 2 children, permanent protection is imperative.
When they had a huge economic crisis, you know, Indira Gandhi actually introduced mass sterilisation camps, which, you know, sounded quite horrific.
Those who accept my advice are taken to the doctor at the primary health centre. Fears about the operation are dispelled before they go in for sterilisation.
They didn't last very long and they didn't work. The fertility rate dropped slightly, but not very much. So if we look at what's happening in the 1980s, India and China's economies were about the same size, which is astonishing to think of now. But then China's just took off with this rapid industrialisation.
Let's talk more about this economic divergence. So if you fast forward today, China and India now have similar-sized populations, but how do their economies compare?
Yeah, well, there's no comparison really. I mean, China's economy, you know, depending on which stat you believe, but it's expected to become the largest in the world, to pass the US in the coming decades. Mm-hmm. It's 5 times larger than India's, which is hugely consequential, right? So India's economy now is still way behind China's, but it is gaining ground. And right now, India's on a tear. The IMF expects India's GDP to grow by 6.1% this year, which is in really sharp contrast to what's happening in Europe and the US. And it says India is the bright spot in the global economy. Last year, it passed the UK to become the 5th largest economy. And by most stats, it's expected to move into 3rd position sometime in the 2030s. So in contrast, when you look at China, in recent decades, it's been a massive overachiever. I mean, the pace of growth, no one has ever seen a country of that size develop so quickly. We all know the phrase, the world's factory, and its successful industrialization has made it much richer, much more quickly. But now, we have a situation where the population is aging, and that's going to put a real burden on China. It's facing the 4-to-1 phenomena. So each child will have 2 parents and 4 grandparents who will be looking to them for their old age. So China's working age population is shrinking, and you'd have to wonder how long it can hold on to that role as the world's factory. It won't dissolve overnight, but we are seeing some major changes beginning and evolving. And all of this is only going to get more pronounced. I think it's impossible to overplay the significance of this shift with India overtaking China, particularly when you consider the prediction that by the end of this century, China's population could be half of what it is today.
It is a mind-bending prediction that China could have just half the people it has today by the end of the century. So let's talk about what the economic and geopolitical consequences of that will be, and how that, along with India's population growth, will shape the world. Let's start with the economics. What will this shift mean for the global economy?
So the UN talks about sustainable development, which means growing at just the right pace so you can afford to, have hospitals and schools and educate workers and then provide jobs for them. It's sort of the Goldilocks rate of expansion, I guess. So the question is whether India now has that and China is losing it. So let's start by looking at India's army of young workers. About 1 in 5 people globally who are aged under the age of 25 live in India. So that's just an amazing statistic, I think. And if you think about what under 25-year-olds are like, their energy, their ability to learn, their ability to adapt, they're key qualities for countries looking to expand their economy and increase their power in the world. So India has a big start. It's got a really strong tech development sector. So we're now seeing companies, including giants like Apple. Atlassian, Australia's big company, has a huge development centre there. So does ANZ. And once again, they're tapping into those resources, those well-educated young people. I mean, traditionally, India post-partition was an agriculture story, and that is changing. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has had a hugely successful effort to push manufacturing with his Make in India campaign. It's really galvanised the country. And you can just tell that there's more and more production and more capital. The private capital market has been slow to develop in India, and that is really coming along just now. But if you look at its biggest asset, we would have to say it's the young workforce. But, it has to get rich before it gets old. This is the demographic dividend that you'll hear a lot of talk about when people look at developing countries. And it can only reap that if it can deliver enough jobs and infrastructure for its young people. And then China, of course, is dealing with a shrinking workforce and this ageing population. Of course, the two are related. People age out of productive work. And this is what economist Kenneth Rogoff is talking about when he talks about China's extraordinarily adverse demographics. So there's no dividend happening there. In fact, it's the exact opposite. So we're now seeing countries shift manufacturing out of China or extending out of China. This is the China Plus One strategy, where you keep some manufacturing in China, but you look for an alternate site as well, a backup, if you will. Mm-hmm. We saw this beginning pre-pandemic when there was concern about the US-China trade war, and we saw it accelerate during the pandemic, or at least planning accelerate during the pandemic when supply chains got so tangled up and China's fierce lockdown strategy made it really difficult to get goods out of the country. Some countries are looking very closely at Vietnam in Southeast Asia, and Thailand too is doing well. But India has a lot to offer. It's an English-speaking country, which is really important. And once again, it has that young, highly educated tech force, and that's what multinationals are tapping into.
So we're at the early stages of this shift in the population rankings. How is that changing the balance of power? Does having the world's biggest population guarantee you a seat at more of the top tables?
Well, if you ask that question in New Delhi, the answer would be a very loud yes. You know, India likes to position itself as the leader of the global south. You know, it wants to sort of be the bridge between the West and developing nations. And now it has the clout, really, and people are listening. Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, because with this expanding economy, you're just seeing this steady queue of leaders turn up. India is the top of everyone's dance card at the minute. Now, they would argue that they've been cheated of their rightful position for decades. You know, they've been mounting a campaign to get on the UN Security Council for a very long time, but, you know, it was easy to ignore them in the past. But now they have the support of countries like the US for that campaign. I mean, clearly the US would like another counter to China and Russia on that 5-person permanent council. So this year, India is particularly visible because it's running the G20, which means there'll be a lot of focus on Delhi, particularly around the summits of the foreign ministers and later this year, the leaders. I was there in March for the first foreign ministers meeting, and the Prime Minister addressed the meeting in English, which is quite unusual for him. He doesn't often speak English.
I welcome you to India for the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting.
And he made very grand, dramatic statements. You know, the multilateral system is broken.
The experience of the last few years, financial crisis, climate change, pandemic, terrorism, and wars.
You have to fix it. We have some suggestions.
Clearly shows that global governance has failed.
We should also talk a bit about Modi's style of government. He's hugely popular at home. You know, there are billboards everywhere. And I asked a friend what he thought, and he sort of looked at me in that inscrutable Indian way and said, it's complicated. Because on the one side, in the decade he has been in power, he has really managed to push through a lot of change that defeated previous administrations. But there are also some quite chilling instances of censorship and control. Just recently, one of the main opposition members was barred from Parliament because he was found guilty of defaming the name Modi. And, you know, he was barred before the ink was dry on the finding. And earlier this year, the BBC did a documentary of Modi in his early years that had some quite damning, you know, accusations of crony capitalism. And the government banned the documentary in the country and also raided some of the BBC offices. And also, I think it is really interesting, and perhaps we don't hear enough outside of India about how proud the whole country is of the fact that it's the world's largest democracy, and they're not going to let that die quickly, so there is a real sort of strength of national character there that might take more than one man and the BJP to defeat.
Mm-hmm. While we're talking about political leadership, what about the Xi Jinping style of government?
On the flip side, of course, if you look at the geopolitics, there's questions about, what's going to happen with China, and will its influence wane as its population continues to shrink? So particularly in recent years, we've really seen China asserting itself on the world stage and really taking the fight up to the United States. We know how important it is to Beijing to reclaim what it views as its rightful place in the world, which is leading civilization. And you could argue that many of the moves it has made in recent years are all aligned to that. So what happens when it's no longer the world's largest country? Will it still be able to exert such power?
And what does all this mean for Australia? Because China is our biggest trading partner. The diplomatic relationship is certainly a major focus. We're a member of the Quad, of which India, the US and Japan are a member of, and that's partly in response to concerns about a rising China. But you've got all these shifts happening economically and geopolitically. What does it mean for Australia and its place in our region?
Well, Australia's right in the middle of this, okay? So we have very interesting connections to both these countries. China's insatiable growth, particularly for our iron ore, has really lifted our prosperity over the last few decades. It's been a huge contributor to the budget's bottom line, and that will continue to a certain extent. But, as you say, if you have lesser people, then there's going to be less buildings, so there's going to be less demand. So that trading relationship will gradually evolve. Mm-hmm. Now, India is not nearly as important a trading partner for Australia. We sell them quite a lot of coal. And the other big trade we have is a people one, which is interesting. So it's students. When I was in India, I think there was all of the group of 8 universities were there as well. They're cutting deals left, right and centre. There's going to be so many different forms of co-degrees and partnership degrees with Indian institutions. By some reckoning, the number of Indian students in Australia will pass the number of Chinese students this year. Mm. And the interesting thing about what happens to those students afterwards is they now have a path, or many of them have a path to residency. This is one of the changes that was introduced when we struck a draft free trade deal with India last year. Last year when I was in Delhi, shortly after the Australian free trade deal was announced, India's trade minister told me the country was looking for more simpatico trading partners. He might not have used simpatico, but he definitely said, we want to trade less with China. And that's why Australia and India have been so keen to emphasise a bountiful future. We saw those incredible images, really, of Modi and Albanese and the chariot being drawn around the cricket ground just last month. Now, this trade deal is an interesting one. It's a real sort of hodgepodge, and it's been described as a signalling mechanism. It was just a matter of sort of trying to get 2 signatures on the line. And Australia did well. There was a big queue ahead of us. But it's not a trade deal as we know it. Most of India's agricultural sector is still completely out of bounds. And the timing keeps shifting for the final agreement. When it was supposed to be at the end of last year, then it was supposed to be at the end of this year. Now people are saying, you've got to be lucky to see it this decade. But even if, it's a trade relationship that is framed differently to the ones we have with other partners, there's no question India will be more and more important to Australia as the years go on.
So looking further out, what does the world look like by the end of the century? Do more people equal more power?
The big question, in the words of a wise Singaporean diplomat I was chatting to recently, is whether India screws it up again. We've seen how nations wax and wane. The economy of India, or the states that make up modern India, was the second largest in the world if you go back to 1800 to 1870. At that time, India's GDP was about 40% higher than China's. Mm-hmm. And in the following century, as we've discussed, it fell behind. Mm-hmm. So it's now opening up and growing quickly. But the region was hugely disappointed when New Delhi backed out of a regional trade agreement, the RCEP, a few years ago. It bowed to the demands of farmers who didn't want to compete. They marched on Delhi, saying they didn't want Chinese dairy in India, and Modi folded. And so, Lisa, economic nationalism could yet derail the economic expansion and prompt India to turn away from international engagement. And of course, it's probably wise not to underestimate China's Communist Party. We know it's determined to regain China's historical status, and it's still on track to overtake the US as the world's largest economy. So this year, the world's largest nation is going to go from China, which has increasingly frosty relations with the US, to India, which is increasingly inclined to cooperate with Washington and its friends, allies and partners. The one factor India has over both the US and China is its expanding population. And I think, Lisa, we can agree that in an increasingly unsettled world, people count.
Thanks, Em. It will be interesting to see how this plays out, or maybe our children and our grandchildren will see how this plays out.
Thanks, Lisa.
Here's the other big stories we're covering this week.
Thank you very much, everybody, and we have to save our country. God bless you all.
Donald Trump claimed he was a victim of political persecution just hours after becoming the first former US president to appear in court on criminal charges. Trump pleaded not guilty in a Manhattan court to 34 counts of falsifying business records.
The only crime that I have committed is to fearlessly defend our nation from those who seek to destroy it.
Prosecutors accused him of trying to cover up a potential sex scandal during the 2016 election campaign. And Reserve Bank of Australia Governor Philip Lowe has warned not enough homes are being built to house an influx of migrants and predicted that rents will continue to gallop higher. He said this, along with high energy prices, was putting upward pressure on inflation, and that meant the Reserve Bank's decision to keep the official cash rate on hold this week did not mean rate increases were over. Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Emma Connors reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.